Thank you, all of you, for still signing up for a Zoom talk in June, even when we're vaccinated and you could be outside enjoying something. So I'm honored that you're here. And I really want to lean in tonight to that imagination theme. And in a sense, I guess I'm going to come as a little bit of an evangelist for the significance of the arts for shaping our imagination as God's image bearers in the world. So in a sense, you could say what I want to do is I want to make a pitch to you tonight about why the arts are for everyone, precisely because no matter what our vocation is, if we are going to answer the call to be God's image bearers in the world, that needs to not just come from convictions that we hold, but from an imagination that has been captured by the gospel and by God's kingdom. And so that's kind of the frame and pitch. I thought, since I can't talk about the arts with sort of showing some art, so I'm gonna bear with an old dude trying to use technology, but I want to share some images with you as I walk through this talk. So let's try this. Let's try this. Does that work? Everybody seeing? Okay. And I'm fear I bit off more than we can chew. So let me dive in. Clint and I talked about this theme of repairing the world, restoring the imagination. Repairing the world is actually this kind of old Jewish theme of a calling to renewal and redemption in the world in which we find ourselves. It's really that Jeremiah 29 vision. And I want to suggest that answering that call requires restoring our imaginations. And I get, you might not think of yourself as artsy. I totally get it. I totally understand. You might not, sort of like a novel might not be the first thing that you curl up with at night. You might even feel alienated by the arts. And I also completely understand that. In a sense, I guess what I'm hoping is we can have a bit of an experience of the arts tonight that would make you open to seeing what God has in store for you in the arts, because God also wants to renew and transform your imagination. My real pitch is this: every vocation needs the arts because we need to transform our imagination. And so that's part of what I want to think through with you tonight. Now, forgive me for a bit of throat clearing, but this is what scholars do because they want to just sort of define some terms and qualify things. The first thing I want to do is make sure that we're all thinking about the same thing when I say art. And in particular, I want us to have a very, very expansive vision of what the arts are, and not think about it too narrowly. I think we sometimes have a habit where when somebody starts talking about art, we immediately start talking about visual art, and that's included, and that's part of one of what I talk about tonight. But I also want us to realize that it's broader than that. The arts are multi-genred. This is a painting that I discovered in DC several years ago. It's by Thomas Leclerc. It's from 1865. You'll find it in the American Gallery at the Smithsonian in DC. And the reason why I think it's an interesting, playful image to consider is because in this painting, Leclerc is sort of toying with the range of arts that are available to us. So if you look over on the left, you'll see sculpture. Obviously on the walls, you see paintings. And then in the corner, and I don't know if it might be hidden by people's faces right now, but there's a photographer who's capturing a scene. And then we have what is kind of a setting of a portrait that's going to be taken. But here's one of the things that make this image so fascinating to me. We have this photographer who's going to take a portrait, but clearly we have a painter who's painting the photographer taking the portrait. So there's these interesting layers. And here's the piece that all of a sudden makes this image come alive for us. Those children are children that the parents lost years ago. And in a sense, what the painter has done is brought back to life, has brought into reality something that, in fact, the photographer could never do. You could say that the fiction of painting, the fiction, quote unquote, of painting captures a truth about love and loss that a photographer could never reproduce. That's the play of all the kinds of things that different genres of art can do. So when I say art tonight, what I would love for you to do is to start sort of loading in all kinds of different imaginations, all different kinds of genres that you might be thinking about. So what do the arts include? Of course, it includes painting. It includes sculpture. It includes novels. It includes poetry. See, a lot of people, I think, don't, when I say art, a lot of people, I know Clint does, but a lot of people don't think about literature. They don't think about literature when they hear the word art. I want us to think about this as expansively as possible. The arts testify to the fact that we as human beings are more than consumers and producers. This is why I think the arts are such a tonic, if you will, for us today. The arts remind us that we are more than economic animals or just thinking machines. As Irenaeus put it, the glory of God is a human being fully alive. And the metaphor I like to suggest is, imagine that God has made you, has made me, he's made us as human beings. We're like 12-string guitars. Do you know what I mean? Have you ever heard people play 12-string guitars in classical? It's an incredibly rich sound and experience. So imagine that you as human beings are created like 12-string guitars, and God has made us that way to generate harmonies that we haven't even dreamed of. A life without art is only playing 6 of those strings, right? A life without art is not realizing the fullness of humanity. In that sense, you could say the arts kind of pluck strings that you didn't even know that you had. And in so doing, you sort of come to life in the experience. So what I want to do is I want to think about the different things that art does. Okay. In other words, I want us to sort of frame this in terms of thinking about what happens when I encounter art. What happens when I'm immersed in an aesthetic experience? What is going on in me? And therefore, what could God be doing in me in this way? My pitch is everyone needs the arts in order to be fully human. And I think that God can reach us and shape us, inform us in our imaginations through this way. Not because the arts convey a message. Okay. One of the ways that a lot of art goes wrong, and especially I would say a lot of Christian art, is it imagines that the point is to sort of get a message out there in a kind of cool and fun and attractive way. Art that is reduced to a message is what we call propaganda. Okay, it's not art. It's not actually imaginative. It's not working the way art is supposed to do. So I want us to think about a way that art is encountered and experienced that isn't just another vehicle for putting a message in our minds, but is instead a kind of experience in which God is, again, sort of pulling to fruition the fullness of being human. And I'll give you a teaser. Here's what's coming. I'm going to say art does these things. Art unveils the world for us. Art adorns the world. Art teaches us to lament. Art is play, and art is encounter. So let's think about this a little bit more. The first thing I want us to realize is art unveils, art discloses, art shows us the world under a different slant of light. And so what happens is when you experience the world that we inhabit through this sort of slant of light that we call the art, you also sort of get a new angle on the world, and on ourselves and on God. We see the world afresh. We see ourselves anew. And this is going to be the important piece. We start to see our neighbors differently, because we've also perhaps been invited to encounter God differently. It's almost like the frame askew on the world that happens in art becomes this portal of illumination. So what I want to suggest is that there is a kind of truth to art that can't be known in any other way. Right? There's actually a way of understanding the world that is carried in these artistic and aesthetic experiences that is a kind of way of knowing that you can't translate into something else. Have you ever heard this quip from Mark Twain? It's this line. He says, "He who carries a cat by the tail learns something he can learn in no other way." So that makes, apologies to cat lovers, but he who carries a cat by the tail learns something he can learn in no other way. And the point is, there is, even if I describe to you so powerfully, like a Mark Twain, what it's like to carry a cat, that will never be the same as me saying, "Here's your cat." Give it a try. And all of a sudden it's like, okay, I understand something I did not understand before. That, I want to suggest, is what is available to us in art. It is a mode of understanding that is sort of untranslatable, but it is still true. It's characterized, my friend Lambert Zeitvart is a philosopher, and he talks about simply what he calls artistic truth. Artistic truth is a way of being true that can't be said otherwise. In fact, he uses an example. This is a sculpture. I don't know how well you can see it, but this is a sculpture by Joyce Wrecker, a sculptor named Joyce Wrecker. And you can see that it's kind of composed of found materials, if you will, twigs, stones, branches. But the artfulness comes from her having assembled them in a particular way. And if we had a lot more time, actually, what I would ask you to do is to just sort of like dwell with this for a second, consider it, and not ask this, don't ask this question. Don't ask, what is it? Just ask, what is this doing in me? What is it? What's coming to the surface for me? What am I sensing? What am I perceiving? What's going on? And then I would tell you that the name of this sculpture is Earth's Lament. Earth's Lament. And that when then probably framed, right, there seems to be a kind of fragility here. Is that a burning bush? Are those eggs, but they're stone? There's all these things that are at play here. And Zeitvart, he comments on, sort of what do I understand about the world's fragility when I encounter this work of art? And he says, why does the sculpture so visibly move its public when it's unveiled, calling its attention and prompting conversation? It doesn't make any direct statement. It asserts no propositions, and yet it offers more than an innovative treatment of materials that, under proper lighting and in the right space, creates a wonderful juxtaposition of angles and curves, of light and shadow, of the found and the fabricated. It makes a world and invites me to see the world in a new way. That's what I would love to come back and give a talk on contemporary art sometime, by the way, because I think some of us are especially alienated by contemporary art and we could talk about that. Here's what I want to suggest. When art works in this way, when it gives you this kind of like new frame, this new angle, this slant of light, as the poet Emily Dickinson called it, what happens is there's a kind of oblique, elusive suggestiveness that is not only opening up the world for me, it's also opening up me. And one of the reasons why I think this is so crucial for us in this time is because I firmly believe that this kind of experience of art is an avenue to empathy, to understanding one another. I think the only way out of our tribalism is when the arts crack our shells, pierce our boundaries, climb over our fences, and help us to see and experience one another again. At the risk, I'm going to take a risk here, and I want to read a little bit from a poem. Are you okay with that? Is that all right? Okay. So this is, I won't have time to read the whole thing, but this is a poem by Margaret Gibson. This was in another recent issue of Image. And it's called What He Knew. What He Knew. And normally I wouldn't do this because I would like the poem to do its own work, but just because of how compressed we're doing this, and I can't read the whole thing, let me just give you the context. This is a poem about her father who is suffering from Alzheimer's. Okay, I'm going to read just 2 sections of it. Before Alzheimer's and during it, when he spoke in stray words or in sounds, he sometimes moved his hands like birds in flight. So that watching his hands punctuate the air, I'd ask myself, am I watching birds disappear or a flower opening? If we can say that language is the house of being, a friend begins. Because I don't know, I enter quietly the house. Each word is looking for the word inside the word, its sequestered essence. Inside beatitude, be. Inside bless, less. Be less. And if illness is a spiritual path, he surrendered loss by loss, word by word, what he'd learned to construct, what he'd learned to imagine as a self. Does he still know you? People liked to ask that question. And then from the last stanza. In the nursing home one morning, doing nothing, waiting, as sun turned the table gold, we were looking at the moth orchid on that table, how its shadow flower made a rounded pair of wings. We were studying Revelations by shadow, or I was, when he reached for my hand, and out of nowhere, fully awake and smiling, a nature ripened and innate said, I'm sorry I said that to you. And although I had no way of knowing what he referred to, he knew. And so I let the moment be the golden flower our lives already are, even when we are immersed in shadow. It's okay, I said. And we kissed a moth's kiss, light, and the moment folded its wings and settled into being. I'm not doing justice to the poem, which is powerful. I wanted you to feel something of how this miracle of words on a page with line breaks and spacing could somehow all of a sudden make you understand the experience, if not of having Alzheimer's, then of caring for someone with Alzheimer's. And all of a sudden, you can sort of know another person in a way that you couldn't before, in a way that reading 100 WebMD articles about Alzheimer's would never do for you. That's the kind of possibility that I think art offers to us. It unveils, it opens, and it opens the path to empathy. Second thing that art does, I'm going to do this very quickly. Art adorns. This is, listen, I think God takes special delight when we make beautiful spaces. When we make spaces that have a verve and a vitality about them that makes us want to settle. There is one of my favorite philosophers is a friend and teacher named Nicholas Wolterstorff. And Wolterstorff says that a defining characteristic of shalom, of the righteousness, the justice, the fullness that the prophets are always speaking about, the shalom of the coming kingdom of God. He says one of the primary features of shalom in the kingdom is delight, is wonder, is enjoyment. And I think I'm talking too long. I apologize. I'm going to skim through this, but I do think art, a part of what art does is it adorns our lives. It adds delight to our lives. It brings joy to our lives. And that happens often in the everyday art that we live with, like this. Also, art that is, I would say fashion, for example, is another example of art that God takes delight in the play of. I want to spend time on this next theme, though. Art laments. Why do we need the art? Because I think art teaches us how to lament. It teaches us how to rage against the dying of the light. In fact, think of this for a second. Isn't it interesting that overwhelmingly the laments that God gives us in Scripture are in what we call the poetic books, right? The poetic books of the Psalms, Lamentations, right? That's where all the lament shows up in the world. And I think this is exactly why the arts give us an avenue. What do we mean by lament? What we mean is confronting the horrors of evil, the sorrows of suffering, the injustices of a broken, fallen, twisted world, confronting those evils, naming them, and yet hoping in a God who redeems and renews and restores. It is, let me give you one example. It is one thing to sort of know the facts of racism, if you will, in this country. It's one thing to even to sort of know and understand those things. It is quite a different thing to read Colson Whitehead's novel Underground Railroad and all of a sudden understand something about the legacy of racism that you could never have understood from reading all the dissertations that have ever been written, right? I want to show you one other example. This is a print by an artist named Letitia Huckabee, who this also recently appeared in Image. And it's part of what's called her suffrage project. And this particular piece is called Sugar and Spice. And it's the print of a young African-American girl who looks despondent. And you can see that her protest sign is sort of, she's been carrying it and now it's just slouched on her shoulder. And she cries out, enough. Enough. The image itself is powerful. What adds to its affective power, right? Why you understand it on the imagination and not just the intellect is because it's also printed on a cotton picking sack. And the very materials in which we are confronting this are now so tactile and visceral that we are sort of encountered by this reality. Now, I think what makes this lament and not just protest is that pink tutu. There's light, there's hope. There's this still a dream of dancing. Like lament, it ends in hope, it ends in praise. This works not because it reaches your mind, but because it's affecting you on the level of the imagination. This is a memorial to fallen workers in Hamilton, Ontario, which is sort of the Pittsburgh of Canada. I'm Canadian originally. This is in Hamilton, and it's in a sense it's an artistic tribute to all of those people who have died building our Hoover dams and our Golden Gate bridges and all of the laborers who have given themselves for the sake of our quote unquote progress. And it's such a power, you can see the sinews and muscles. It's such a physical bodily experience. And you can see this person grasping for dear life what makes this lament is, do you see that shadow? Do you see the way that shadow falls? And does that look familiar? Is that a crown of thorns? Is that the man of sorrows who we know defeats death and rises from the dead? Is there a play of light even here that suggests resurrection? It's such a powerful, affective subtlety is one of the features of good art. Sorry, I can't resist talking about this one. Clint, give me 3 minutes. This is called the Tomb of Madame Longans. It's actually in porcelain. This is at the Getty Center in Los Angeles. This was a pastor's wife who died in childbirth. She died on Holy Saturday, that dark day between Good Friday and Easter resurrection. The skulls, of course, are what remind you of mortality, the evil of death that befalls us. But do you see what's happening here? Is mother and child are climbing out of the grave, right? Here is a memento mori that reminds us of the suffering of mortality, but it's already picturing that coming day when the dead shall rise and we shall see finally this child that we never got to meet in this life. We shall be reunited once again with this woman. What a powerful portrayal of heartbreak and hope, all in one piece. It's a remarkable work. I think one of the great gifts that the arts give us today is a way of living in this tension and the juxtaposition that is lament, which is naming the horrors and entrusting ourselves to a God who raises the dead. To live at that intersection is a very, very, very difficult task. And I think the arts hold that tension together better than anyone. Okay, the arts also let us play. This is a pas de deux from Tchaikovsky. I want to just make a pitch for it. You know, sometimes as Christians, we're so somber and serious, and we're like, we got to have reasons for everything, and there's got to be like a point, and I've got to make an argument. Here's one of the points I want to make about the arts. God delights in play. God delights in the imagination let loose and running. There's a certain kind of when the surprise and the of just a kind of sheer delight, the sort of experiences that just make you smile. That's not useless. That's God also reminding us something about the way a shalomed world is, the way a just and flourishing and full creation looks like. It can be, I want to suggest, it can be a very profound act of resistance in a world that demands everybody produce. To play is to rest. That means play is a kind of Sabbath. It's a way to keep Sabbath, and the arts invite us into that. This is another way in which I think this is a series of fashion pieces by Iris Van Hepburn, which I'll just leave you to be intrigued by, because there's like, what's the point? What's going on here? What's the point? There's no point. It's just because, like, look what we can do. Look what we can do. It's crazy. All right, let me draw this to a close so we have some time for conversation. Ultimately, I want to suggest that art is about encounter. And art is about encounter with other image bearers and with other culture makers. By the way, this is one of the reasons why I think it's really important. Sometimes Christians are a little bit sort of like nostalgic about golden ages of art. You know what I mean? Like everybody wants to go back to Florence in the 15th century or 16th century, which, sign me up, I'll go. But let's remember, art is still being made. Art that is meaningful and God-fueled is still being made. And when we confront these works of art, we are encountering others. And sometimes we'll just revel in the artifice of it, the way a building has been made. Architecture is such a powerful art that shapes us. Or it might be this, I picked this. This is a shot from the film Roma by Alfonso Cuarón. I don't know if you've seen it. If you haven't, that's your homework for this weekend. It is a stunning film. And this is, if I knew how to do tech, we would watch a clip and not just look at this shot. But what happens is this is an amazingly long shot, one shot. The camera never stops, it never cuts. And it's one long shot of a very, very harrowing scene on this beach. And finally, it all comes together in this one frame, just as the sun hits the horizon. And it illuminates this family in all of its vulnerability. And you sit there and you're just weeping at not just the story, but that he could compose this. It's such an incredible experience, and it does something to you. That kind of creativity, I want to say, humbles us. It's mesmerizing in a way that sort of like decenters us. It opens us up to a creator, and to a creator who could make such creators. So why are the arts important? Because in a sense, art is a gymnasium for your imagination. And the reframing, the retraining, the redemption of our imagination is what is going to fuel our ability to repair the world. All right, I'll stop there. Apologies if I went a little bit long there, but thank you very much for, I'm sort of trying out new ideas on you too, so you're a little bit of guinea pigs tonight. So what should we talk about? Clint, you're in charge.
No, everyone's going to be very disappointed that I just had to unmute myself. I think we would have signed on the dotted line for another 20 minutes. But it was brought to a close beautifully. So I'll ask a question. My friend Andrew, who you met earlier, is going to help me a little bit as well. But I'm going to ask a question. We have some questions from our fellows, which are about liturgy, which maybe we'll tie into a little bit.
We can talk about, yes, I'd be happy to talk about that too, by the way.
Well, we'll get there, I'm sure. But my question is this, and this is, apologies, I hope this isn't like a pet project of mine that I'm reading into here, but a lot of the things you say here, so art unveils and adorns, helps us lament, it helps us play, and it leads us to encounter. I can't help but think that all of these definitions are the meeting point of form and content, that Christians sometimes get so bogged down in having the right answers, the right content, but they never think about the form in which it's packaged, right? We're happy to go online and issue statements and tweets and 13 articles of this or that, but we don't think, what's the best way to do this, the way that inspires the imagination? And so my first question to you is I guess just to ask you to think a little bit more, if you would. It's a bad question, I hate these kinds of questions, but a little bit more about the opportunity afforded us when we unite form and content through a Christian lens.
Yes. So I think you're absolutely right, by the way. And in a sense, I think when we keep imagining that you can sift out and separate form and content, that's when we are prone to then just turn the arts into propaganda, because we think, oh, well, these are really just kind of a vehicle. These are just a channel to sort of deposit ideas and get the word out. Do you know what I mean? Like cue 99.4% of every Christian movie you've ever seen. Do you know what I mean? It's just like, oh my God. So the reason why I think, and by the way, I'd love to hear more of your thoughts on this too, but the reason why I think that inherent intertwining of form and content is so crucial is because of the incarnation. So let's go back theologically. What we mean is this: when God most fundamentally and radically unveils himself, he does not send a message. He arrives as the Son. And it's interesting. I don't know, in Hebrews chapter 1, now I'm going to be embarrassed because I'm not going to remember the Bible, but it goes something like this. At various times in various ways in the past, God has spoke through the prophets, right? He's kind of given messages in the past, but in the fullness of time, God spoke, and the Greek is literally in Son. In other words, the language God speaks is not just conveying information. The language he speaks is Son, which is the embodied God man who meets us where we are, and we encounter him in the fullness of this enfleshed God. I think that, and the gospel is not just Jesus's teachings that he left us. The gospel is what God enacted and accomplished in Jesus's very being, doing, death, burial, resurrection, and so on. So I think that incarnational impulse is why then for Christians, we need to, we can't really separate form and content, right? There's that intertwinement. However, that also doesn't mean that there are just like this narrow repertoire of forms that are baptized as the Christian forms for doing things, right? Does that make sense? In other words, you would never want to sort of like freeze some particular aesthetic period or form and say, see, there, God sanctified, that's what painting is supposed to look like. That's what sculpture is supposed to look like. Instead, what we're looking for is the Spirit calls us to discern what forms faithfully embody. But there's room for creativity in how that works itself out. This is why, I mean, you're a modernist literature scholar. There's, you know, what poetry could be did not end with George Herbert or John Donne. There were always new possibilities for what a faithful poetry could be. And I think living into that dynamism and realizing it's not just about a message, it's not just about the content, it's about how we embody it. That's I think the most exciting part of the arts too. Am I tracking with your question though? I'm worried I'm
No, absolutely. I mean, I think I've got so many things to say. All I'll say is that when I meet other Christians who are into literature or literary scholars, when I say like, oh, I'm into modernism, postmodernism, 20th century, there's always that moment of like eyebrow furrow,
yeah.
sort of.
I thought you were a Christian.
Yeah, you don't do Renaissance and like Victorian literature, like, you know, where the morals are a little easier. But to your point about play, I still reserve a place where I'm like, well, this is interesting to me. I don't know how to explain it.
Yes.
But again, I could go on and on. I'm going to cede the floor here. Andrea, I know you have questions as well that have been coming in. Why don't you take us away?
Yeah. So you've written on formation and discipleship, and for anyone who's not familiar, it's more of, my understanding is more of embodiment rather than legalism. But where does engaging with art and culture fit in there? You kind of mentioned it when you talked about play and Sabbath, but does it fit in anywhere else?
No, this is great. So just to very briefly rehearse, my argument is that, if you will, sanctification in the Christian life, discipleship, isn't just a matter of uploading the right beliefs, ideas, and doctrines in our heads. It is about God's Spirit apprenticing our hearts and habits so that we are formed. So we're not just informed, we are formed to become people who bear God's image for the sake of the world, okay? Now, because our habits, our wants and longings and desires, because our habits are primarily matters of affective disposition. They are sort of like a feel for the world that we carry in our body. That means that the Spirit's means of transforming us can't just be intellectual fueling. It has to be habitual unlearning and relearning the Spirit. And that happens in bodily ways. This is why I make the argument, and you know, I don't know enough about your congregation, how this all works out, but this is why I make the pitch for the most potent and formative forms of formational practices are things that we can recover from the ancient and medieval and early Reformation churches, which are a series of practices that rehearse the gospel by taking our body through rhythms and rituals. I'm forgive me, but I'm pro-ritual. Okay. Now, okay. So to build, Andrew, to build to the question, I would argue that that is fundamentally an aesthetic mode of the Spirit getting hold of us. Let's take a very simple example. I think the most potent liturgical rehearsal of the gospel is Lord's Supper, Communion, Eucharist. Okay. Why? Because it touches all five senses. We hear, we taste, we see, we smell, we touch, right? Why? Why is that significant? Because the way to the heart is through the body. In a sense, that's what I mean by aesthetic, an encounter that is tactile and visceral. I would also say that what's going on in worship when God is renewing and restoring and reforming us is he's really planting a different story in our bones. That's why the narrative arc, you talked to Tish last month, so you've got all this, but the narrative arc of the way worship reenacts the gospel is really restoring our imaginations. Again, that's an aesthetic idea. This is then what, finally, I'm actually getting to your question. This is why then finally, I think the arts are integral to full-orbed formational worship. Do you know what I mean? It's why I think we should be attuned to the environments in which we worship and ask ourselves, what's the wallpaper of our church, so to speak? Like, what are we absorbing when we're not thinking about it? What's the sonic environment? What does music sound like here? And what are the formative powers of that? What visually is our imagination being invited to contemplate? And is that suggesting to us something of what God wants for his world and so on? I think the arts will be the way that we renew the church's worship.
Yeah, that's good. You said you're pro-ritual.
Yeah, which I know that sounds like a bad thing for a lot of people.
No, I didn't interpret it that way. I mean, I'm sure someone's going to interpret something every way that it can be interpreted. But you said that you're pro-ritual, and it reminds me of a question that got sent to me actually from one of our congregants, Amanda Ruth. I don't know if she made the call tonight. I hope so. But she was thinking about some of your work on liturgy and ritual and practices and habits. And in our fellowship, we've even talked a lot about breathing and the way in which kind of Christian worship kind of manages breathing. And I'll make a plug that probably the most breathly art form is poetry because of the caesuras and line breaks and punctuation. And so you can actually learn a lot about kind of controlling your breathing through reading and like listening to poetry, even trying to read it. But she raises a really great point, which is, I'm guilty of this too. When I think of liturgy, habits, and practices, it is a largely Western and European frame that I'm thinking in. It's a Reformation model. It's even a recovering things from a Catholic or Orthodox model. I wonder if there's anything to be gained from investigating, adapting thoughtfully some Eastern practices or some non-Western practices or non-majority practice. I just wonder if you have any thoughts on that. That might feel like a strange question.
No, not at all. I think so. I think the answer is complicated because I want to qualify one thing, which is, and this might not seem intuitive. So I just want to slightly resist our inclination to imagine that the ancient sort of Catholic order of worship is European. It's not. It emerges in Palestine, and it makes its way to Ethiopia before it ever makes its way to Rome. So there's been Ethiopian Christians worshiping according to the sort of narrative arc and paradigm that we think of as historic Christian worship longer than there have been Christians in Paris doing that. Do you know what I mean? So I think it's a beautiful way in which the history of the church's liturgy is actually beautifully complicated. And the forms are older than just their European dominance or something. However, that said, I also think it's really, really important that we don't fall into kind of liturgical, and this is in the spirit of the question. There is no pristine liturgical form that fell from heaven at some point that we're trying to claw our way back to. I think this is very important. So I'm a big proponent of Catholicity, which is receiving gratefully the inheritances of the Christian tradition as it's been handed down, but that is never about repristinating a past. It's about reappropriating that for the sake of embodying it in the present, which is also why it always involves reform. I would say two things. It always involves reform and contextualization. And I think one of the things that we've done wrong is we just sort of like, a lot of people fell into the illusion that like, oh, we got the liturgy figured out now. And now we just sort of pick it up and it's portable and we just drop it anywhere that we want. I think the church's worship has to be constantly reformed in response as a faithful extension of what has been handed down to us. And so I absolutely think that that's going to work itself out contextually. It's in our congregation we sing a version of the Our Father that comes to us from Pakistan. There's such a like beautiful give and take in that reception. But I also would say that, like, for example, if you think of liturgy, Christian worship as counterformation, right? It's kind of counterforming the deformative power of lots of cultural liturgies that we didn't realize were forming us. Sometimes we might have to innovate because of new things we need to counter. Like, I've been thinking a bit about, I actually think a new intentionality about silence in worship would be a powerful way to resist the ceaseless noise and chatter of our sort of online worlds. Do you know what I mean? Like, what would it look like for the church now in this moment in which we find ourselves to lean into contemplative silence as a way of resisting these deformative modes? Now, in some ways, we would be recovering ancient practices, but we could be also innovating. I think there can always be faithful innovation in that regard. So yes. I think the church's worship is always a mutt. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's why I'm Protestant. It's why I'm not Eastern Orthodox. It's why I'm not Roman Catholic. I am a Catholic Protestant because I think we are all heirs to this beautiful mess that is the church's worship.
Andrew, back to you.
Okay, so this is going a little against what you said earlier, but is there a point where if we're consuming art, and you mentioned art galleries, we're constantly consuming art, is there a point at which we must produce, or is it just a natural outflow and engage in art that way?
That's a really interesting question. Here's how I think of it. So on the one hand, no matter what your cultural vocation is, God is asking you to bear his image to and for the world in whatever cultural sphere you are working in, and to do so redemptively. And I think the only way to become the kind of people who are able to do that is actually to center yourself in the imagination studio that is the church's worship. So to me, that's actually the primary sort of imagination forming experience that makes us the kind of people who can do that work. Now, I'm also saying, I think that there are reasons in achieving the fullness of being human to incorporate the arts into our rhythms and practices. when I say everyone needs the arts to shape their imagination, I'm not necessarily a big fan of then the line that everybody is an artist. Do you know what I mean? I think everybody is imaginative. I think everyone is imaginative. And I think everyone is a maker of some sort. It might be, you might be making a family. Like that's a creative endeavor. Well, more ways than one, but it's a creative endeavor. I don't think it means that we all then have to sort of produce art. Now, I'll confess, I struggle with this because it's like every time I read an amazing novel, it's like, I want to be a novelist. Do you know what I mean? Like I was just like, I want to make things like that. I want to make. I watch Roma and I'm like, I want to make a movie. But it's also very humbling when you start to try and you're like, oh, there are gifts involved in this. There's craft and expertise. So yeah, I don't think everybody has to think of themselves as an artist. Though I also am a big fan of everybody sort of hobbying their way into creativity. Do you know what I mean? Like I think if we spent more time in our evenings making things we would never show to anyone else, that's time better spent than just the ceaseless input into us in that way. Yeah.
Andrew, you unmuted. I'm not stepping on toes, am I? Well, let me ask maybe just one or two kind of concluding questions here as we draw on the hour. One is from the chat, which I'm interested. I don't know that you have a strong opinion on, but someone has asked about Father Couturier, which my French is not great, but I assume it's Marie-Elaine Couturier who made a call mid-century for the return of fine art to the church that they had patronized and sponsored. And so I want to ask if you have thoughts about that, about the church as a patron and housing and sort of questions around ownership, but also what the debate, what that debate and what that question perhaps enlivens in us as we think about the church's future in patronizing and supporting the arts.
So yeah, that's so yes, I absolutely believe the church should be a patron of the arts. I think that will perhaps look different than we immediately imagine, in the sense, on the one hand, I think we should be commissioning artists to do original creative work for our churches. I'm also interested in, are there ways that the church could imagine investing in artists as a way of serving the world? In other words, I'm wondering is there an aesthetic equivalent to the food pantry, to the thrift store, kind of thing? Is there? And my one idea is, this is harebrained, but it was something I was just talking with a friend about. We have all this space in churches all over the country. And what would it look like if we just turned a room or two into an artist studio or a writer's den, and we sort of unleashed some artists to have the space to make? And by the way, there's all kinds of risk involved with that, and I think we should sign up for the risk of it. But I think this sense of the church just saying, we believe in the fullness of being human, and we think that maybe there are so many aspects of our culture that grind down the fullness of being human and turn everything into utility. We want to be an exception to that. And one of the ways we're going to do that is by sort of trying to make room for artists. I think that's could be a very powerful countercultural long-term game, by the way. Do you know what I mean? Like this is the thing. If you want to patronize the arts, is you're really signing up for the dawn of a kind of cultural renewal whose end you might not see. It's like signing up when bricklayers signed up to help build York Minster Cathedral, they were never going to see it done. Do we believe in something enough to sort of commit ourselves to a multi-generational project. Yes, absolutely. I hope so.
All right. Well, it is 8 9 Central. What 8 9 Eastern? I don't
That's
know.
right. Yes.
I'm so bad at all things time, which is why I'm excited for your new book. But if it's okay, I'll thank everyone and ask you one final question in hopes that you can leave us with a word. But thank you everyone for being here tonight. Again, our final city nights. I hope you are as energized as I am about our vision at City Church to support the arts. I know, as Jamie was talking about commissioning arts, I know that many of you who have come to City Church know that we have painters on site at a lot of our services who are doing live work in person. And that's a commitment of ours, as is spoken word poetry and art that you've heard at many of our services. We exist to bring beauty into broken places, primarily through the promotion of aesthetics, which, to give you my definition of aesthetics, it is the meeting point of forming content in the most broad sense of what that actually means. And so it's an honor, Jamie.
Beautiful. So glad to hear that, by the way. That's great.
Yeah, that's really a huge part of our vision here. And so it's just the perfect note for us. But the question I want to leave us with, or leave you with to have a final word, is this talk is repairing the world, restoring the imagination. We've thought a lot about what that looks like. Repairing the world is a very broad, not broad, but very overwhelming task. But to try to drill down just here in the final moments, what do you see as the primary obstacle to the restoration of the imagination in the modern Christian? That may be an unfair question. So maybe I'll just say one of the primary obstacles that is really competing for our affection, such that it's very hard to be in an imaginative place. Any thoughts on that to close us? It's a negative question, but maybe you can make it affirmative for it.
It's a great question, Clint. The hurdle, the roadblock, the scandalon. How could we define it? Yeah, I think it's okay. Can I just muse a little bit? I don't have a good answer right away, so I'm just going to think out loud for a second. The one, I think, broader cultural dynamic that also seeps into the church that forestalls our embracing the significance of the imagination is this sort of enforced need for productivity, right? In other words, there's something about, like, everything has to generate something that is useful and that comes with a return on investment. Do you know what I mean? I would say there is, and by the way, I want my retirement fund to do well too. So I'm not picking, there are places in a life where looking for ROI is appropriate. What is dehumanizing is when all of life is governed by a return on investment dynamic, because now everything is just being leveraged, instrumentalized, utilized. And in a sense, as soon as you do that, there is no leisure. Where there is no leisure, there is no culture. And where there is no play, you could never have the allusivity of the arts. And I think what's sad is the extent to which Christians have ended up sort of buying that story and almost identifying it with Christianity. And I think that's probably one of the most debilitating. The other thing I would say, and I won't say a lot about it, is I do think fear shuts down imagination, right? Because what happens is when you are scared, you move into a panic mode and all you care about is survival. If all you're doing is surviving, you don't have any margin to make, to invent, to create. And so maybe there's probably a way in which those two things are intertwined. But it's a very suggestive question. for which you got a lame answer.
Not at all. Not at all. Please, everyone, join me in thanking James K. Smith for joining us for our last sitting.
Thank you, everyone.